I'm GREER. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Kongregate. And with me I've got Anthony PECORELLA, who's our developer relations manager and works really closely with all of our virtual goods developers in particular, onboarding and promoting games. The idea behind this talk is that we feel with a pretty broad variety of games on Kongregate, we have sort of a special view across a lot of games, and that we would sort of present some of our stats about games to reveal what sort of things are meaningful for monetization and give kind of a broader perspective across games and do some compare and contrast. Basically, we're going to focus on sort of what works, what doesn't, looking at ARPU, ARPU, and then get into gameplay. So I'm going to give the broad overview, and then Anthony is going to go into more details of the gameplay since he's played them a lot more of the games a lot more deeply than I have. But let's get started. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Kongregate. We are an open platform for games, principally a website. Anybody can upload, and then we have various APIs and things to enhance the games, ranging from statistics and achievements and high scores to a whole virtual goods platform, including currency, accounts, etc. We get a lot of games. We have over around 45,000 games currently, and 1,300 new ones are uploaded every month. Most of these are single-player, flash games, casual, things you play for 45 minutes, but they really range in depth and type. We get about between 14 and 15 million monthly uniques currently, and we monetize with advertising through our direct ad sales force, and then the virtual goods platform I mentioned. Everything is done on a rev share basis with developers, and then one big FYI, big change for us is that about a year ago we were acquired by GameStop. Mostly that hasn't changed things very much. They're just supporting us, and we're continuing to grow along the path that we expected, only with more resources and opportunities to market to GameStop customers. Let's see. So for, what do we have, between 14 and 15 million uniques? It's, for players, what we're offering is game discovery. We have tons of content and pretty much most everything you could be looking for in browser games. And we use ratings and recommendations to bubble the best to the top. So, you can go to other sites and see a mix of games, some good, some bad. Pretty much everything on the homepage of Kongregate is going to be, something that's really quite fun to play. The other thing is that we add a lot of things that I think makes the gameplay more meaningful. We add a lot of social features in particular. You have a profile, you can earn points, you level up, there are achievements, you can make friends, chat, comment on the game, there's forums, etc. And all of this gives everything you do in a game more meaning and more persistence, which is very addictive. So the site itself is a game in a way. The one thing is that there's kind of nothing really casual about our players. They're young male core gamers, 85% male, average age is 21, median is 19. They love strategy, they love action, shooters, RPG, tower defense, very much core genres. And they index very high for console game ownership and PC gaming. We look very similar to, say, IGN or GameSpot if you look at us in ComScore. And they play a lot of games. Active registered users average 35 game plays a month, so more than one a day. And they love their badges and achievements. Creds is our currency. It's very similar to Facebook credits. So very analogous. You can spend it in games across Kongregate. We deal with all of the payment integrations, the customer service, the fraud modeling, etc. And people take currency from game to game. We launched it in late 2008, actually before Facebook. And at first we were looking at the games that were already on our site and trying to work with developers to fund them, to give them resources and advice to help them add virtual goods to their games. If you see the chart at the left part of it, you can see that we didn't do a very good job at that. It's really hard to make a good, well-monetizing game, and it was a big leap for them, and it was a big leap for us, and we learned a lot, but we didn't make a lot of money. When things really took off was in the second half of 2009 when we started reaching out to people who had MMOs and social games that were doing, selling pretty well off Kongregate, and we're looking for more distribution. As we brought those on, those really started working, and it clicked, and we've been growing very fast. Currently, we have 75 Creds games, and 75 games out of 45,000 games are driving the majority of our revenue, which is a little astounding. Brief sales pitch context on us. ARPUs on Kongregate are generally higher than what you see on Facebook. For games, usually what we hear from developers who have them on both platforms is that it's 60 to 100% higher than on Facebook. And though our overall audience is smaller, because the amount of traffic that they get is often the same or double, so a lot of people are making more money. There's some reasons behind that. One is that everyone is a core gamer and really focused and interested on games. They're there to play games. Another thing is that when you're in a situation where you're advertising to get the next customer, you're bringing them on kind of one at a time, and it can be hard to build up a critical mass of people, particularly in a multiplayer game, and socially connected. And whereas we, kind of dump people in and can dump, hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of concurrents in pretty quickly and kind of get you over a social hump. And then the final thing I think that really helps is that the achievements that we put on games really incent players to play your game a while and give it a chance. And once we sort of gotten them to play your game 5 hours, then if it's a good game, there's a good chance that you've got a long-term addict. The game genres that are successful, and here I'm mostly looking at the virtual good ones. RPGs, of course. Collectible card games have done well. Tyrant is a good game that's a good example of that. Strategy and empire building, sort of Ebony, Caesar-y clone type of things. Tower defense, that's been the most successful, particularly in the single-player genre, but also Backyard Monsters in the multiplayer side. Deathmatch, live PvP, there's a game called TDP4, which is a shooter game that does well. And then sim and management type games, which is a sort of interesting one. Swords and Potions is a new game from EdgeB that is a pretty good example of that. I'm about to do a big old stat dump, so I want to give some definitions of what I'm talking about, so I'm not doing it all as I go along. Everything we're going to be talking about here are lifetime stats, so things to date. That favors games that have been on the platform longer, but generally we see that within 3 to 4 weeks on a platform, game stats are in the range of what they're going to be. They're just going to gradually go up over time, but it's about how they're in the right range. ARPU is average revenue per user. ARPUPU is average revenue per paying user, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I mostly see it written. What we define as a player is a registered user who loaded the game at least once. We don't know if they actually interacted with the game, though they probably did. And then what we call a reg is a player who has played that game, loaded that game at least 10 times, and an addict is one who has loaded it at least 50 times. Okay, so big old chart here. This is taking all of our games that meet some minimum requirements in terms of numbers of players and numbers of buyers, and charting their ARPU on the vertical axis by their ARPUPU on the horizontal axis. So you can see that there's a really strong 10 line going along this, where the higher the ARPPU, the higher the overall monetization, with some interesting exceptions that are a little bit more driven by conversion. You can also see there's a really huge range in ARPPUs from $5 to getting close to 180. In terms of, you can see a little bit things breaking out in genre. The sort of high ARPPU ones tend to be the more traditional types of MMOs and strategy, RPG and strategy games. The single-player games tend to clump down here just because there's a cap on what you can spend on. And then there's some interesting outliers. Tyrant is a collectible card game. Swords and Potions is the sim, and a few others that are sort of a little bit off the charts. These tend to be the ones that are in sort of the slightly different genres. So ARPPU is really important to ARPU. Retention, I think you probably heard elsewhere, is really important to ARPU. We look at retention in 3 different stages. You can look at say DAU by MAU, but that's kind of a blunt instrument. It doesn't really, it tells you sort of a overall stat, but it doesn't tell you too much about what's going on in the game. So we break it into 3 stages. The first one is percent repeat. What percent of players who play your game ever return? This reflects initial impressions, interest in the game, and attractiveness, initial interest. The second one is what we call repeat to reg, where we take what percent of the number of players. Percent of players who repeat, and what percent of those become regulars. And this kind of reflects what's going on in the sort of late, early, middle stages of your game, and how strongly you're really hooking them then. And then finally, the stat that we look at is reg to addict, and what percent of those regulars become addicts. And this really reflects the engagement of your end game content. If they run out of missions, what happens? So how does this correlate to ARPPU? Well, first of all, this was even a little surprising to me when I ran it. The percent who repeat doesn't correlate to ARPPU at all, ARPU at all. You can have, here's on this axis, you see a game that only 30% of return. So 70% of the people who played that game said, not for me, turned around, never came back. And it's still in the higher end of ARPU. So whereas the reverse is totally true, where 60 or 70% like the game enough to come back, but not enough to pay anything in the long term. So, it doesn't really mean anything to ARPU. It is important still, but it's important to rating, spread, and overall number of players that you get in the game. It does correlate to revenue, but it doesn't correlate to ARPU. If you look at repeat to reg, now you're getting somewhere. It's not the strongest trend line in the world, but you can, it's not a cloud. There is a line, but there's a lot of exceptions too. So what you're doing in the middle of the game matters, but if you get to the reg to addict, suddenly you have a really, really, really strong line on monetization, which basically says that monetization is about the end game and what you're doing with players in the long term and not at the beginning. There's a few people down here who are, not monetizing well and have good addicts. Generally, when you look at those games, it's because there's a lack of some lack of content, some lack of things to buy that's going on. I think one of these spots is Everybody Edits. I don't know if any of you saw Chris Benjaminson's talk about that game at FGS yesterday, but it's kind of a little bit of a hobby game where he's sometimes adding content, sometimes not, and that's, he's built a strong game, but there isn't the content to buy, and that's holding it back. But generally, creating addicts is what it's all about. This is the gratuitous penny arcade comic, and it's really, tells the story of what I'm about to talk about next. So I wanted to look, back at that earlier slide, we saw the big range in ARPPUs. So here we delved in, what I did was we delved into the buying patterns of two games that have similar overall ARPUs, number of players, and revenue, but radically different ARPUs. The high ARPU game, the average spend is 119, and the median is 16. The low ARPU game, the average spend is 24, the median is 5. So huge difference. Okay, so now we've got a chart showing how much of the revenue is coming from what group of buyers. In this game, 40% of the revenue is coming from 2% of players who are spending more than $1,000. 90% of the revenue is coming from players who spend 100 plus. The top well has spent almost $7,000. So not too surprising that the average is 119. What's really interesting, this is the low ARPU game. Look at the charts. They look really similar. It's still about the whales. Even with a game where the average spent is $20, most of the revenue, the majority of the revenue is coming from people spending more than 100. 5% of the players in this group are spent in the 100 to 500 range, and that represented 42% of the revenue. This game doesn't have the really high-end whales. The top whale is spent about a little over $1,000, so it's still quite high. 65% of the buyers have spent less than $10, and that's still only 9% of the revenue. So it's just really crucial that people be able to spend at the high end for a game to make money. There needs to be kind of no cap. When we look at single player games, that's the real limitation. If all you can spend is $5 or $10, the only thing that you can control is how well they convert. And it may be a really good return for the amount of time you spend on the game, and we definitely see some really good successes on Kongregate, but the scale of what you're going to scale of revenue is just going to be a lot smaller. And now I'm going to turn it over to Anthony.
All right, thank you. So that was a great overview of kind of the state of virtual goods games on Kongregate. I want to talk a little more specifically about things that we see specific games doing that are or aren't working, that have an impact or don't. And one of the first things that we noticed was that developer activity is very important. Doing regular updates, bringing in new features, hosting events, all of these things help drive engagement and keep the players interested in playing the games, and therefore also making purchases. Along the same lines, doing a sale or some kind of a special, you'll see a nice spike in sales, and somewhat contrary to what you would expect, you don't see a huge drop afterwards. So it's not that everyone jumps on the sale and then stops buying, you just get that nice spike and not too much lower. So I'd like to look at a couple of games that we did some tracking on. This was a kind of strategy MMO that was released fairly early with us. And I've highlighted, I don't have the full history of what they were doing, but I've highlighted a few events that I'm aware of. When the game first launched within the x-axis there is weeks. So at the beginning there, that's 2009, week 45. The y-axis is revenue, but we've, of course, left off the numbers since that's kind of private. But you'll still get a good comparison picture out of it. So we put them on the front page. You see a jump. We featured them a little later, and you see that big spike.
Featuring, that means we put achievements on it.
Right, yeah, so we added achievements to it and gave them a big front page feature. So that's kind of the biggest level of promotion that we do for a game, at least early on. They hosted some sales throughout, but there wasn't any new content, which is why you see that spikiness right in this area. But without any new content, you see a kind of a downward trend. We did run another promotion with them in the middle, and you can see it comes up quite a bit, but then starts sloping down again. They then spent months working on a huge new release, and new release came out. It looks like a little spike, but that's double to triple what they were seeing before. But the problem is they had run out of steam earlier, and so they didn't get their 2x wasn't as big because they hadn't updated regularly.
They lost too many players.
Right, exactly. Now, if we look at, we mentioned Dream World, you saw as kind of a high spot on a lot of those graphs. This is the Dream World graph. You can see early on they actually followed a very similar pattern to the other game. We had the same front page spot and then added achievements and featured them. And they actually started out smaller than even the other game did. Ran some little events, but eventually had a somewhat downward slope. Added some new content in here. Then they started running these events. They did a Labor Day event, a Christmas update that added more content. Another expansion was released here. I know there was an Easter event that was run. And each of these other spikes are events that they ran. Occasionally, some of these are big spikes because we promoted them, but other ones, we would just see a spike in revenue from the previous weekend and have to email them and say, hey, what'd you do? And we ran the Bastille Day special, and that would generate these huge spikes. But you still see an upward trend as he's running on this kind of regular 4 to 6 week interval of either doing some major event or some update to the content. And that is, it's not overloading the player, so they're not expecting sales constantly, but it's enough that it keeps them interested, grows the user base, and grows revenue, so that the game, a year and a half later, is doing significantly better than it was even early on.
And growing user base because it's keeping the players that it has while we were adding new ones, and so growing.
Yeah, high retention and exposure. So I was looking for a clever title about guilds, and my coworkers told me just to keep this one. So guilds are a way of players on Kongregate tend to be very game focused. They find a game they like, they look for other players within the game that are playing the game and want to interact with them, and guilds are a way of doing that. They allow in-game communities to form, and they are very strongly associated with purchasing as well as retention. People in community or in a guild will encourage each other to perform at a higher level than they might otherwise. Competition arises. The end game gets more interesting, because even if you get through all of the single-player content, you still often have guild competitions that remain interesting in the long term because other players are still interacting with you. So if we look, Dreamworld, again, has guilds and a very interesting guild system that's very active. 13% of non-buyers are in guilds. To contrast that, 80% of buyers are in guilds. Now, certainly buyers are going to be more engaged in the game or more likely to get in a guild anyway, but to see that kind of jump, there is very clearly something going on that is very engaging and very interesting about guilds that is leading people who are playing the game to be much more likely to buy. The developer also reports a 3 times increase in retention among those that are in guilds. And again, that's the social component, the social pressure of your friends wanting you to keep going that can increase retention significantly. Another game, War Metal Tyrant, is a collectible card game that also features guilds or called factions in that game. Similar stats, 6% of all users are in factions, while 41% of paying users are in factions. So you see a similar kind of pattern to Dreamworld, but a really interesting comparison. The revenue per user for non-faction members, 19 cents. For faction members, $3.87. So huge, huge difference there for people who are in factions. And a lot of that is probably attributable to what Emily was showing with whales. If you're not in a faction, you're going through the single-player content, you're going to want to buy some cards to help you through that, but you don't have that same kind of, let me spend money to show off to my guildmates or to help them through a battle. And the whales are the ones that are going to be coming out of the social components as opposed to the single-player components, and that you can see heavily in the ARPU stats. So, myth of synchronicity. A lot of times we think hardcore gamers are going to be only interested in real-time synchronous combat or challenges. You think of World of Warcraft and Call of Duty and StarCraft, and it's all about real-time competition. In our setting on the web, in more social games, we've actually seen that even among hardcore gamers, that's not the case. Of our top 10 highest-grossing games in 2011, only 3 of them have synchronous multiplayer. Synchronous multiplayer definitely can do well, but is not required in this medium to be a huge success. And so that's just something we thought was interesting.
If you have to add something, guilds are a lot easier and more powerful than synchronous multiplayer.
Absolutely. And yeah, both Dreamworld and Tyrant that we mentioned on the previous slide, neither of them have synchronous multiplayer at this point. Energy systems. And no groans or anything? Okay. So we see energy systems a lot in virtual goods games. This can either occur as a kind of a literal energy system where every action you take requires energy and energy slowly rejuvenates over time, or you also see kind of a variation of it, usually in strategy games, where building something takes real world, 4 hours, and so you can only do so much at a time. You have to come back later to keep building on your city or whatever you're working on. I talked to some of the developers that are using this, and some of our top developers, and they were reporting that monetization of energy systems is very low. Less than 10% of their revenue is from people spending to get more energy so they can keep playing immediately, which kind of raises the question: why is this so compelling? What is it doing, and is it really worth having in the games? Well, it creates scarcity and therefore value in playing the game. People want what they can't have, and there's a very strong psychological component to playing a game and then not being able to keep going until you come back a little bit later. And so as you're going through the day, you're thinking, oh man, once I get home, I can go try this again and keep progressing. And so it makes you more invested in what you're doing, and it creates this extra value in playing that we've seen very consistently. The games that do the best have some kind of energy system. And I'll talk a little bit about how limiting this needs to be, and it doesn't have to be really, really tight, but I'll get into that in a little more detail, but it's definitely a pattern that we've seen. But if you do put it in your game, don't expect it to be the main monetizing point, is kind of the lesson there. So let's talk about some games. Not all games are successful, of course, and what we're hoping to do is kind of analyze what makes the games different, why some games have done better than others. Certainly, there's going to be confounding factors. We're not going to be able to nail down and give you a perfect recipe, but hopefully we can learn a little bit from some examples. I want to put a disclaimer. In each of these comparisons, both games are high-quality, well-made games. I would recommend anyone in here try any of these games because they are fun. The point is not to judge the difference in quality, but to try to see what else they did that did not work on a monetization side specifically. So, first up, the deathmatch match. Stick Arena Ballistic by XGen Studios, a top-down arena-style deathmatch game, all real-time combat. TDP4 Team Battle, which was one of the ones that was highlighted on a graph earlier, is a side-scrolling shooter, has some kind of capture the flag stuff going on. And, both games have been highly rated on the site. Actually, all the games we're going to talk about are in the top 2% of ratings on Kongregate. But they monetize very differently. Stick Arena monetized primarily on a subscription model. The game was almost entirely free to play. There were a couple of extra maps you could unlock and a few extra weapons you could unlock by paying for a monthly or yearly subscription. The value proposition ended up not being really, really compelling. You could get almost all of the gameplay for free. You could be very competitive without spending any money. And so we didn't see really high conversion rate, and I'll highlight that with some numbers in a second. TDP4, on the other hand, monetized by selling stat boosts, gun upgrades, consumables, things that had very immediate and tangible impact to the players that would allow them to compete at a higher level. Stat boosts you could get if you spent a long time playing the game and upgrading your character, but it allowed you to get ahead quickly and compete at a higher level by spending a little bit of money. And that proved to be very compelling with our players. Stick Arena also didn't have any growth or RPG elements. You could rank up, but it was primarily aesthetic. You could buy pets and spinners, but again, it was primarily aesthetic. Some players really enjoyed it, but among the hardcore crowd, the competitive side of it is what's really going to drive the larger revenue. While TDP4 had character experience, stats, leaderboards with rewards, where if you were in the top 100 players for the day, you'd actually get in-game currency for it. It's all about competition. It was about engaging the player, identifying themselves with their character, and getting invested in it, and that was very powerful. As a result, TDP4 ended up with a slightly higher revenue per paying user, but a purchase rate of over 15 times Stick Arena's. I'll give this slight I'll say that Stick Arena did come out a year earlier than TDP4, and so that probably has led slightly to a lower purchase rate. Creds have grown significantly on the site. People have gotten more used to them, but indication is still that that TDP4 would have converted much better than Stick Arena, even if they were released at the same time. The MMORPG IRL PvP. I'm sorry to anyone that understood that sentence. So these are role-playing games. Fantasy University by Simultronics is a hilarious game if you like geek and pop culture references. I'd certainly recommend trying it out. Dream World is not quite as humor focused, but it's still a deep and interesting multiplayer role-playing game on the site. Fantasy University by Simultronics, Dream World by Playmage. So Fantasy University initially had a low social and competitive component to it. Most of the social side was inviting your friends to help you out in battle, which was interesting but not really compelling to our players. I put an asterisk there because they have recently added guilds in PvP, and we're hoping to see that kind of turn things around a bit. But the initial offering didn't really keep players. It didn't have that same retention and competitive nature to it. While Dream World has full-fledged guilds, it launched full-fledged guilds within a few months of launch, and that's probably the start of that upward trend that you saw in the earlier graph, and very competitive PvP that players really get into. Fantasy University, as you progress, stays low pressure. You don't really get to the point where you're getting really tight on being able to complete the next task, and a lot of the purchases are kind of like long-term investments, and they don't have kind of an immediate relief of pain for the player, which is nicer for the player, but is not going to convert players as well into purchasers. Meanwhile, Dream World is much more high pressure once you get into the game. The start is very easy. You go through it, you keep progressing, but you get to a point where it gets into a little bit of a grind, and you have the ability to spend some money to make you again competitive on either the PvE or the single player or the PvP side. PvP, I'm sorry if anyone doesn't know, is player versus player. It's the multiplayer side. Fantasy University also had very few permanent upgrades available for purchase. A lot of them were items that were great temporarily, but that you'd class out of, temporary boosts, but nothing that was really, that you'd see as an investment that would immediately help you, but would also stick with you in the long term. Dreamworld, on the other hand, this was really interesting to me. Learning points, which are basically stat upgrades for your character, 60% of their revenue is just people paying to increase the stats of their characters, which was really striking to me. As a result, Dreamworld has a 6-time purchase rate and a 4-time per paying user value over Fantasy University. So, I see some pictures taking. Okay, I think everyone got it. And all right, last comparison, collectible card game duel. Etheron by Ninja Kiwi is a fantasy collectible card game with some nice RPG elements for your main character, big card collection, very cool battles. War Metal Tyrant is more of a sci-fi card game with these small 11-card decks that you do quick duels in. Etheron uses live PvP exclusively right now, while Tyrant uses asynchronous PvP. This is kind of interesting because the live PvP is very compelling, but it's harder to get kind of the critical mass, where if you don't have lots and lots of players, it's hard to find an opponent. And I think Etheron is having a little bit of trouble with that at the moment. While Tyrant was able to, even with a very small audience early on, give the sense of having a very large competitive audience because you could compete against anyone's deck asynchronously. So PvP took off very quickly in Tyrant, while it's a little slower in Etheron. Etheron lacks guilds. It's on the way, so we'll see if hopefully that helps. But at the moment, it's primarily single player outside of the PvP elements, and again, the PvP is having trouble taking off due to volume of the audience. Meanwhile, Tyrant has guilds from the start, as well as cooperative raids where 100 people can work together to take down some giant monster. And that leads to a lot of communication within the game as well as externally. We have a live chat next to the game and a forums, and we see people constantly posting saying, help me out with this raid, come join my guild. And that kind of community is built around it, and these constant communications are just keeping the players interested. New players that come in are seeing people talking about these guilds and immediately getting interested in them, and it's really kind of grown the community.
Yeah, it really endorses that this is a valuable use of my time when you see people, see other people playing the game, even if you're not playing with them.
Sure, yeah. Etheron also has an initial play session that's quite short, about 10 minutes before you have to start waiting for your hit points and magic points to replenish. That's how their energy system works. While Tyrant is much more lenient early on. You can play 30 minutes straight before you hit any kind of energy limits. This likely is a turnoff for a number of players. Kongregate has mostly free games, and so players are used to jumping in and being able to play for as long as they want early on. And when you get cut off right as you're getting interested in it, but before you're really delved into it, it can lead to a lower retention rate. Tyrant, on the other hand, waits until you're much more interested in the game and have seen a lot more of it before it starts hitting you with the limits for the energy. Interesting chart. The time at level was just kind of an estimate that I did from playing through it. But this is you level up in Tyrant as you're playing. You spend about 5 minutes at level 1, about 15 at level 2. Level 3 goes by a little bit quicker at 10 minutes. But altogether, you're looking at, about 6.5% of first purchases are made in the first 30 minutes of gameplay. So allowing players to play through without limiting them early on is not going to hurt you a lot in terms of your first purchases, and is going to let the players get more invested into it. So, energy systems can be effective, but don't be really draconian with them early on. You want to let them get into the game, let them get interested before you start, having your play be limited. As a result, Etheron has a much lower purchase rate than Tyrant, lower revenue per paying user, and the repeat users, Tyrant is one of our highest repeat user games for virtual goods. While Etheron, you can see, has not brought as many back, and which is likely a combination of the short play session as well as the low social components. I think that's it. So we'd like to open it up to any questions anyone has, and yeah. Sure.
Hi there. How do you differentiate, knowing some of those early slides, how are you differentiating between your sort of early users and then regular ones and then regular ones and the addicts? Is there some metric that you're using to identify those?
We're just looking at number of plays.
Sorry, for the recording, we need to repeat.
Okay.
So the question was, in case someone couldn't hear it,
Thank you.
how do we identify the metrics of repeats, regulars, and addicts, and the conversion from repeat to regular and regular to addict?
Yeah. We're just looking at gameplay. So a repeat is anybody who's played 2 or more times. Reg is anybody who's played 10 or more times, and an addict is anybody who's played 50 or more times. So you can, if you're an addict, you're in all of those groups, and then we look at, then we do a ratio of what percent are addicts and what percent are regs to get those conversions, so that we can isolate, what's happening at each stage. Does that make sense? Okay.
Okay. Yes?
What percentage of Kongregate visitors use the Kongregate system?
Let's see, in any given month, between 2 and 3% purchase credits.
Yes?
What's the developer revenue share? And it's a two-part question. And how much of what percentage of the games make the most amount of money? Is it like the 80 rule?
Want to repeat the question?
So, well, on the revenue share side...
we need to repeat the question.
Oh, sorry, repeat the question.
So the question was, what are our developer share terms? And the second one is what percentage of games are driving the revenue? Is it the old 80-20 rule? I'm going to answer the second one first, which is that it is the old 80-20 rule, but that probably where the top 5 games are, probably, I think it's at the top 5, it's the majority of revenue, but
Sounds about right.
There's significant revenue down to about 25 or 30. And in terms of the developer share on ad revenue, you get ad revenue, it ranges from 25 to 50 based on integration. On the cred side, we're still kind of working out it's We tried several places. We've been at 70-30 net. We're currently at 50-50 gross, but we're looking at changing that for ongoing games. So we're going to split it into two groups. One group is 70-30, sort of the industry standard with no promotion, and then what we're going to be calling partner games, where we're sort of investing in long-term heavy promotion if a game is hitting certain stats, and which includes things like GameStop promotion. So it's either 70-30 or 50-50, depending on what you're whether you sort of qualify for the program, and both of us think it's worthwhile.
All right. I think we have time for 2 more questions. Yes?
It might depend on the game, but which countries have the higher purchase rates?
So U.S. is
Sorry,
oh, yeah.
the question was, in general, which countries have the highest purchase rates?
And generally, U.S. is the highest, but Western Europe is not far behind. So U.S., Canada, English-speaking, and then Western Europe is a little bit far behind. A little bit farther, the rest of the world, it's not that high.
Right. We are an English-only site, though. Like, we don't have localized versions, so that's certainly affecting that.
Yeah, but yes, U.S.
All right. And one more question in the back.
Is there a particular theme that is like favorited on Kongregate at all, like a fantasy, for instance?
I mean, the typical fantasy and sci-fi that you see with hardcore games are certainly very popular, but we've seen popularity with much more whimsical, like Bloons Tower Defense and Backyard Monsters are much more cutesy style. We've seen there's some Asian games that have kind of the traditional kind of like Chinese historical look that have done well. So there is some variety, but
I think if players go in and see on the splash screen sort of that slightly generic fantasy look, it does turn some of them off. On the other hand, there's a lot of cleavage, and that turns some of them on too. So I think I think games that have a slightly different setting actually have a slight advantage, but traditional fantasy does work well.
okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you guys.
Yeah.